You want me to play this one?
Sure.
This past summer marked 2 years since the Supreme Court ruled on the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, the case that protected the constitutional right to an abortion in the United States. A new report out today by the organization Pregnancy Justice takes a look at the consequences of that decision, reporting that in the first year after Dobbs, at least 210 pregnant people faced criminal charges for conduct associated with pregnancy, pregnancy loss, abortion, or birth.
It's a good one.
Yeah. Good and bad, right?
Good and bad, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a ton of cases in the news of patients who are being prosecuted for what may be miscarriage care, self-managed abortion, or, just complications of pregnancy. And there are some patterns that happen with criminalization of care, and we wanted to talk to an expert about that. She's a professor of law and the former co-dean at the Rutgers Law School in Camden. And she was the first woman, the first Black person, and the first member of the LGBTQ community to be a dean at Rutgers Law.
My name is Kim Mutcherson. I have been a law professor for 25 years now. Went to law school to be a public interest lawyer. And when I graduated from law school, I worked at a place called the HIV Law Project. And we did a lot of work. All of our work was with people who were low income, but we also did a lot of work with women who were living with HIV. And that was a really amazing opportunity to see lots of the ways in which women who are considered, for various reasons, not to be good mothers, get treated really poorly in this country. And those lessons were really important to me. And so when I ultimately ended up going into academia, I decided that that's the kind of work that I wanted to do, that I wanted to be focusing on things that were potentially controversial in terms of parenting and parenthood, that I wanted to think about poverty and race and gender, and all of those fun things. So that's what I've been doing ever since I started this. Once I had the experience of being pregnant and having 2 babies, that was really formative as well in terms of thinking about what it means to be a person who gets to control what happens in and on your body, what it means to be somebody who has not just autonomy, right, not just the freedom to make choices, but the resources to make choices that are the right choices for you, the right choices for your family, and also really being steeped in a very historical mindset about what this country is capable of and things that have been done over time. We can go all the way back to slavery, but we certainly don't have to. And, understanding the kind of sterilization abuse that happened in this country for a whole range of women and also people with disabilities, thinking about the ways in which children have basically been stolen from their community. So, Native American boarding schools that were literally, the slogan was kill the Indian and civilize them. I mean, just extraordinary things that have happened. And so I'm always really connected to, and maybe part of this is because I was a history major in college, but I'm always really connected to understanding where we have come from and how important it is to understand those things, because when we don't know them, we can backslide. I think we have seen that, right? And we're sort of sitting in it right now. And so I think it's just so crucial to be not just focused on what does it mean to be a person who has autonomy, what does it mean to be a person who has legal rights, but also what does it mean to build a country that frankly has never been a country that cares deeply about everybody. But if that's the country that we want, then that is an ongoing process that we have to be engaged in. As I say to my students, you are laying a foundation for a future that you may not see, but what a nice thing to know that you are part of the bricks that are building a better house here.
I think one of the things that people maybe aren't aware of are patients who are criminalized for seeking care, and criminalized for seeking miscarriage care, for seeking abortion care, and it's an area of expertise for you. So I was hoping maybe tell us a little bit about that, about what that means and how that happens for patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So it happens in a range of different ways. And one of the things that I always, I don't know, it's not always an applause line when I do talks, especially to medical people. But a lot of the ways that people get criminalized is by the healthcare providers who they go to for care. Somebody shows up at a hospital, they are miscarrying, and somebody at the hospital says, I wonder how this happened, right? Is this just a miscarriage? Is this a self-managed abortion? And next thing you know, they're calling the police. Somebody shows up at a hospital and had a stillbirth, and somebody on the care team says, was this really a stillbirth? Is this a pregnant woman who was using illicit drugs and therefore has some responsibility for the fact that there's a stillbirth, although there's no, they don't have any information, but they have lots of suppositions. And so they call the police. Or somebody, somebody shows up and gives birth and their child gets tested for illicit substances. And it turns out that there are some in the child's blood. And then they call the police. So it's this very difficult set of circumstances where people are doing exactly what they should do and exactly what they have the right to, which is accessing healthcare when they need it. And then somebody on that care team, whether it's a physician or a nurse, sometimes it might be a social worker in the facility, decides, I'm not sure what went on here. And so rather than engage in conversation with the patient and try to understand that, too often the instinct is, I'll just call the police and let them sort that out. Women get judged a lot for a lot of different things, and the expectations in particular of what it means to be someone who is pregnant. And that can be, some of those things can be relatively innocuous, right? It's a woman who goes to a coffee shop and who's pregnant, visibly pregnant, and she orders, coffee that's not decaf, and somebody in line says, are you sure you want that? Which, the level of mind your business involved in that is really extraordinary. That's obviously a very innocuous thing. But then also think about every time you walk into the women's bathroom in a bar and there's a big sign that says, if you're pregnant, you never drink alone, right?
Hold on, that's a thing in bars? Seriously?
Yeah. You don't spend much time in women's bathrooms. But absolutely, yes, that is a thing in bars.
Wow.
So there's this extraordinary way in which people who are pregnant, people who have recently given birth, people who are parents are deeply policed in this country. And so on some level, it's probably not surprising that folks who are providing medical care also like to get into the policing game from time to time.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that the public has some sort of ownership of your body once you're pregnant, they want to touch you.
Yes. So one of the classes that I teach at my law school, and I've taught it for, almost the whole time that I've been teaching, is a class called Bioethics Babies and Baby Making, which is absolutely super fun to teach. But one of the things that I do with my students very early on in the semester is I do this thing where I'm going to give you a thought, and then we're going to puzzle through it. And one of the thoughts that I give them is pregnant bodies are public bodies. And we sort of wrestle with that over the course of the semester in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different contexts. But for me, that's really one of the core issues that's involved in all of these questions, whether it's about abortion or it's about assisted reproduction or it's about, criminalizing pregnant people. Fundamentally, it's this society and this world really trying to figure out, once a person becomes pregnant, do they cease to be an individual who has all the rights that are normally accorded to a person who is competent, a person who is an adult, a person who is able to make decisions? And we are far too cavalier, I think, about deciding that pregnancy standing alone is a reason to think that somebody is no longer capable or no longer should have the capability of making decisions about what's going on in their world.
Yeah. And if you're living in a state where you don't have access to abortion and you're forced to continue that pregnancy, then you're held hostage by pregnancy.
Yes. Hostage is such a great word to use. And it's such a devaluation of women as people, right? It's such a fundamental way of deciding that this entire class of individuals is lacking in some profound way, and therefore needs a bunch of random men in a state legislature to decide what are the good ways for you to be a woman? What are the good ways for you to be somebody who's pregnant? What are the good ways for you to serve our nation? All of which should sound really creepy, right? And feel really creepy. And yet, I think because there is this sense of pregnant bodies as public bodies, that people get behind it, right? In ways that would be absolutely anathema if you did it to anybody else. But somebody gets pregnant and all of a sudden we're doing things like you get arrested for a drug crime and you're 6 months pregnant. And normally the judge would say, all right, we're going to release you until you have to come back for trial. But then the judge in this case says, well, you're 6 months pregnant and you're a drug user. So we're going to go ahead and send you to jail because we think that's safer for the baby, which first of all, as I always like to say, if you think that people can't get drugs in jail, and probably worse drugs, frankly, than they were getting on the street, then you completely misunderstand how the world works, right? But a lot of people will say, well, if you're pregnant, then of course we should treat you differently because now you have a responsibility that you're not taking care of. And so the state has to step in and make sure that you're making better decisions for you and for your fetus.
Yeah, we have this terrible 72-hour mandatory counseling that we have to do in person now. And when I talk to people about it, it's sort of like the legislators have decided that we need to sit women down and put them in the corner for 3 days so they can really think about what they're doing. And it's, I think people have come to accept it, when they go through the counseling and they say things like, well, it didn't really help me make my decision, but maybe it would help someone else. Like they're trying to be generous in their thinking about it. But it's really terrible to have to say the things that we have to say to people before they can seek care.
And then also, sort of think about, states that there are always these sort of waves of different types of legislation, and ultrasound requirements were one of those waves of legislation related to abortion. And that idea too, right? That you're coming in, say, for a first trimester abortion, and you don't understand what's happening in your body. So we need to do an ultrasound so that you understand that, that there's potentially a baby that's growing in your body. Like, first of all, the vast majority of women who have abortions in this country have had babies before. They are already mothers. So that's deeply, deeply insulting. They're making decisions about what makes sense, not just for them, but for the kids that they already have at home. And again, some group of men in a state legislature say, she probably doesn't get it. And so why don't we make sure that she has an ultrasound, that she has to sit around for 72 hours before she can have this abortion, that not only are we going to require a higher level of consent than that is required literally for any other procedure, but we're going to tell you what you have to say as a healthcare provider. It's such a wild system, but it's one that we've been living with for decades now, which is also wild when you think about it. Decades we've been doing this to folks. And then, the Supreme Court decided Dobbs and said, we're not awful enough. Let's figure out how we can make it even harder for people to terminate pregnancies.
It's a crazy presumption that not just am I going to direct your eyes, but I think, right, like the only way you could be making this decision is because you don't get it, right? Like you don't understand it enough.
Yep.
Yeah, quite a presumption.
And there's also those sort of background assumptions about what good women do, right? Good women all want to be mothers. Good women, if they find themselves pregnant, should be excited that they're pregnant. Good women, and I've actually heard anti-choice people say this, that there is sort of no higher purpose for a woman than to be pregnant and to have babies. And not only that if you die because you have been pregnant or because you die, in childbirth, that is the greatest sacrifice that you could make. Even if you believe that to be true, I would argue that the person who gets to decide whether that's the sacrifice you want to make is the person who's going to die, not some random protester outside of the clinic. So underneath all of this are really fundamentally challenging and offensive ways of thinking about women in general.
When we think about the people in the system who are criminalized, it's not, not everyone. It's not everyone that gets kind of picked on and gets turned into the authorities. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. There are disparities everywhere in the United States, and there's a disparity here too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, if you sort of think about it, right? If you are a person who has private insurance and you're sitting in your doctor's office in a, nice little setting in the suburbs somewhere, it's very infrequent that that physician is going to ask you or make the kinds of suppositions about who you are that will be made for a woman who is getting her care in a public hospital somewhere in a city, and who already has, quote unquote, too many kids at home. So again, all these sort of judgments about who people are, about what behavior they're engaging in because of who you think that they are. And as a consequence of that, we see things like poor women who get criminalized a lot more than women who are affluent. Nothing shocking, particularly about that. Women of color tend to get criminalized more. Although it's been interesting post-Dobbs, Pregnancy Justice, which is this amazing organization that does advocacy for pregnant people who are criminalized, did a study of prosecutions of pregnant folks post-Dobbs, 2 years after Dobbs, and they found over 400 prosecutions for various types of behavior, whether it was miscarriage, stillbirth, all of that good stuff. And most of those women were white women. And part of that is because of the opioid epidemic. And so going after women who are using opioids while they are pregnant, whether it's because they have a miscarriage or they have a stillbirth, but still poor, and still women who are marginalized in a whole host of different ways. And then, of course, if you're younger, if you are somebody who is undocumented in this country, right, all of those pieces of the puzzle that make you less likely to be able to demand the respect that you shouldn't have to demand, but that should just be given to you. All of those kinds of characteristics are going to make it more likely that you'll find yourself being criminalized. And that criminalization, again, and I think that this is just so crucial, often starts in front of a healthcare provider. It's not somebody showing up at your house out of the blue. It's because somebody who you went to for healthcare decides you're a problem, and the way to fix your problem, because what we have shown in this country is that nothing fixes problems like prison. Right? If you really want your country to come together, put as many people as possible into prison. And I hope that the sarcasm is being channeled there. So the response then is, here's a person who potentially has problems that need to be dealt with, who maybe she's in need of various kinds of assistance. And so I'm going to go ahead and call the police because that somehow seems like the best way to get her assistance. Or I'm going to go ahead and call the police because I don't like this person. I think that this person makes terrible decisions. I think that this person shouldn't be pregnant. I think that this person, if she gives birth to a baby, shouldn't be able to raise that baby. So there's all of these levels of judgment that are involved when people are picking up the phone and saying, not, can I call somebody to figure out how to get services for someone who seems like they need services, but I think that this person should be punished because they happen to be pregnant.
One other way that people end up, I think, calling the police that we've seen is confusion, right? So medical providers who aren't sure what their obligation is in a particular situation. And it's, I think one of the areas of confusion, for example, is, I'm a mandatory reporter for child abuse. And if depending on how my state defines a pregnancy and a fetus and fetal status, do I have to call if there's drug use or do I have to call if there's, right? And I think, or, this abortion occurred later than would be allowed, like at a gestational age that's later in my state. What's my obligation? Do I have to call in that situation? And I'm wondering if you can give some practical tips. I mean, for our national healthcare provider audience of their law in each state. No, I'm just kidding. But how should you approach, what's the right way to approach those situations where you have confusion, other than if you don't want to call the police, for example?
So as a starting point, before I say anything, everything that I say is not legal advice. And I promise you that anybody who is working at a hospital and who has a general counsel's office, the last thing that they want is for you to be listening to me, what your obligations are. So just want to put that on the table from the start. So I would say when people are faced with a set of circumstances where they're trying to figure out, should I call the police here, is first of all, are you allowed to call the police? Right? The assumption that HIPAA just automatically disappears because you think that a crime may have been committed is a very erroneous assumption, right? I mean, HIPAA has a lot of exceptions to it, no doubt, but those exceptions are frequently not as broad as people think that they are. So first of all, are you allowed to call is the first question that I would say that people should ask themselves. The second question that people should ask themselves is, are you required to call? And again, there are probably far fewer circumstances in which people are required to call than they think is the case. I think sometimes calling the police is depending upon who you are and what your life experience has been, calling the police is kind of a knee-jerk reaction when you kind of don't know what's supposed to happen in a set of circumstances. So there's something valuable in saying, let me just take a step back for a minute before I pick up that phone and dial 911. And then the third question that I think people should ask themselves is, what are the consequences to this patient if I make this phone call? Do I think that the outcome of this patient being criminalized is going to somehow be better than trying to figure out what is going on with this person and what is it that this person needs that may make their life better, that may make the lives of the children that they're taking care of at home better? So, I am a person who my first thought is almost never going to be, let's call the police on a patient. And so really being very conscientious about, again, am I allowed to call? Am I required to call? And what happens to this patient if I take them out of a medical environment and instead put them into a carceral environment?
We have given this talk a number of times, and one of the things that Bev often says during the talks is that we're doctors, not detectives, right? Yep. It's not our job to figure out what's going on to a certain extent. And some of that's uncomfortable, right? Because you want to figure out what's going on medically. And so, you maybe want to have the whole picture. But I think another part of it is you may not need all of the information that could compromise the patient to provide excellent medical care. Like if you're seeing someone who is having bleeding in the first trimester of pregnancy in the emergency department, and, I want to know whether there's been instrumentation in their uterus, but I don't really need to know whether they took medication, right? Like that doesn't make a difference to the care that I'm providing to the patient in front of me. And so it may require a change of mindset in terms of another part of it is approaching it with our values so that we're behaving consistent with our values. But then secondly, being thoughtful about what information do I need to treat the patient in front of me?
Yeah, absolutely. And then even if you're getting that information that seems to have implications that you're not prepared to deal with, you still have to say to yourself, is this information I should pass on, right? If you're asking it because you feel like it's useful in terms of providing care, that's one thing. But then there's a second step that you have to take to decide, okay, I got this information and somebody gave it to me only because they thought it was related to the care that I was going to provide to them. And then I'm going to turn around after they've given me that information, and I'm going to share it with police officers. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of orgs that are, sending pills across state lines and giving people access to self-managed abortion will tell people, If you have that rare complication and you end up going to a hospital, don't tell them you took pills. I don't know that we want to live in a world where people are thinking to themselves, I don't want to tell my healthcare provider how I ended up here. But that's a thing that is absolutely going to happen, right? If people think that you are not a safe person because you are a person who will call the police on them, they're not going to tell you things. And sometimes the things that they won't tell you are things that you absolutely should know in order to be able to provide care to them. And that's a loss to the patient, it's a loss to the provider, and frankly, it's a loss to the profession overall.
But I think people do have reason to mistrust the medical system. I mean, we've talked about the many ways that, the medical system, doesn't do right by the patients that they serve. And so if it's the first time you're meeting a physician in the emergency room, you have no idea what their values are, what they care about, but doctors care for patients all the time that are doing things that are against the law, and we don't turn them in. And so there's something about pregnancy, and we've talked about this, it's this judgment and this different layer of expectations that we put on women. Like during pregnancy, if you're using illegal substances, if you're, bleeding and, having any, doing anything that could be questionable, then people want to turn you in. And so I think people have a reason to mistrust the system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's unfortunate, obviously. And again, as we, talked about before, some people are going to be surveilled in ways that other people are not, right? So if let's say you're, 6 months pregnant and you're getting your health care in a public hospital that mostly serves poor people of color in a particular urban area, you may be thought of and treated very differently than that same 6-month pregnant person who is in a private doctor's office, and that physician never says to that woman, hey, are you taking any illegal drugs? Right? Because the assumption is that you're not, because you're a good person. Whereas, the folks in that urban hospital, they may be asked some very different kinds of questions. They may be tested without their consent, right? All these sorts of things that happen because we, again, are sort of starting with this premise of once you are pregnant, your body's not really your own. It really is a creature of the state. And we have a right to dictate what you do to it, where you take it, what you put into it, because the state has an interest in that potential future person. And ignoring, of course, all the ways that pregnancies don't end in a healthy birth and a healthy baby, right? Which is the other thing that's so interesting about so many of the things that we talk about, this assumption that as soon as you get a positive pregnancy test, if you do all the right things, you are obviously going to give birth to a healthy baby at the end of that. Ignoring how many miscarriages happen, ignoring the number of stillbirths that happen in this country, really one of the highest stillbirth rates in the world, ignoring women who die during childbirth. So this idea that pregnancy is this kind of idyllic time and so exciting, and you're going to have this perfect baby, and then you're going to go home and you're going to be perfect, really ignores the reality of pregnancy in this country.
Yeah. It's depressing.
It is depressing. And part of what's so depressing about it is when you look at states that are the most harsh about access to abortion, they are also the states that have the worst maternal mortality rates, the worst newborn death rates. They are the states where it's the hardest to get access to good prenatal care, right? So they won't do any of those things that we know will have a positive impact on pregnancies in their state. But what they will do is tell you, you have to stay pregnant, right? I mean, the hypocrisy of that should be embarrassing to these folks, and yet somehow it isn't. I think another part of the problem here, and we were sort of intimating this earlier, but I want to sort of say it explicitly. We don't teach people about their bodies. We don't do good sex ed in this country. And so folks really don't know how common it is to have a miscarriage. And so, of course, you feel like, what have I done if you have a miscarriage? And the truth is, probably nothing. If you're not able to get pregnant, and women are consistently blamed, right? Women are consistently treated as you are the problem in this set of circumstances. Women are consistently shamed for what their bodies do or what their bodies don't do. And within that system, the idea that you would take somebody who's already feeling this sense of shame and guilt and blame, and then say, the cherry on top of all of that is we're going to arrest you. Your name's going to be in the paper. So everybody's going to know that we did this, and potentially you were going to spend years in prison. And I don't say that as an exaggeration. There was a case in Alabama, and Alabama is pregnancy criminalization central. I don't know what's going on in Alabama, but somebody needs to check it out because it's deeply problematic. But there was a case in Alabama of a woman who gave birth to a baby. Baby had meth in their blood when they were born, and then ultimately died, which could have been for a range of different reasons. And she was prosecuted. A jury found her liable for that death, even though there was no medical evidence to tie it to meth use. And they sentenced her to 18 years in prison. And she just got that sentence vacated and got a new trial. So she'll get a new trial in 2026. But she has spent years in prison already, right? That's time that she's never going to be able to get back. And for the rest of her life, her name is going to be attached to, all of those Google hits about here's this person, here's what she did, and here's what she caused.
Why aren't our systems set up better to protect patients? I mean, I don't think people went into medicine to judge other people, to punish, right? Like, people articulate exactly the opposite of that in all sorts of medical fields, allied health fields, right? They would articulate exactly the opposite of that. So why aren't our systems set up to better protect patients in this way?
I think that there are a lot of different elements to the world that we live in now. So one of those elements, I think, and this is not to contradict what you've just said, but I think there is a group of people who do sort of see themselves as these huge do-gooders who understand the world better than their patients. And so they feel like there are decisions that they can make on behalf of those patients because they're smarter, they're more well-educated, they make better decisions, blah, 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 blah. There's a certain arrogance in medicine. And I feel like I can say that because my dad's a doctor, my mom's a nurse. So I feel like it's all right because I love them. So I think that's, an initial problem. I think that medical schools often don't do a terrific job of helping medical schools, nursing schools, all the allied health professions don't necessarily do a good job as people are learning, inculcating in them a sense of the harm that happens when you lean into your hubris. Really asking people to be much more humble about who they are, what they're doing, and what they understand about patients. I think people don't get enough education about what the law allows and what the law requires. And so they sort of act in these very knee-jerk ways without a lot of thought to it. And frankly, we live in a country that is much more willing to put money into prisons and warfare than into healthcare. So we have made very clear what our priorities are, and our priorities are not making sure that we have, first of all, enough healthcare providers, right? I mean, that is a cliff that we are rapidly falling off of. But then not only enough healthcare providers, but people who have been given the tools to do their work well with a really wide variety of patients. And so many people don't get that. So even if they go into this work thinking, I'm a good person who's going to do good things, and then they get confronted with these circumstances that feel really difficult and ethically complex and morally awful in some way, and they don't have a skill set to respond to that. And the only thing that they are given is, well, this is a person who maybe did a bad thing. And the way that we deal with people who do bad things is we call the police on them, which is sort of the easiest way to respond to that. And if you haven't been given the tools and the opportunity to think in really complex ways about what is your role as a professional, and then what do you owe to patients, then the easiest thing to do is the thing that allows you to walk away from it. Right now I've made it somebody else's problem and they can figure it out or not figure it out. But I've done what I need to do in order to get somebody else thinking about this issue, and I can put it behind me, which I think is a very human response to difficult things. So, I'm not sort of judging that on that level, but I also think that people make the mistake, and I don't even get why people make this mistake, but people make the mistake of thinking that jail and prison are somehow supportive environments. I don't know why people think that.
I think they just don't understand. Right? I think so many of the students that we teach come from backgrounds of tremendous privilege. They've never had a negative interaction with the police. And they think they're just, these people that are going to come in and help and fix things. And, you'll go through the system and you'll be better off for it, and don't understand that that's really not the reality of how the system works.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And even if you sort of think about, and I know we've talked about substance use disorder a lot, but it becomes this very important space in which people get criminalized. People assume, oh, well, if you get arrested and you're pregnant, they're going to send you to a rehab facility, and then you're going to get this like wonderful amount of care. One, fundamentally misunderstanding that the vast majority of rehab facilities have no interest in having pregnant women, right? They don't want that liability. They don't want that risk. So it's incredibly hard to find a bed for somebody who is pregnant. And certainly if they go into jail or they go into prison, first of all, there's a risk to forcing somebody to withdraw in that way, right? That creates risk not only to them, but also to the fetus that they are carrying. And there's no guarantee that they're going to get the kind of support that they need within a carceral system that allows them, when they get released, to be like, all right, I'm ready now, right? I don't want drugs anymore, and I'm going to do all these other sorts of things. That's not stuff that people just have to want it enough, right? I mean, there's a reason why we talk about medication-assisted withdrawal for people. There's a reason why we talk about, making sure that if you're pregnant and you have substance use disorder, that you have access to a clinic, to a healthcare provider that's going to be talking to you about how do we maintain you during this pregnancy, so that you can be as healthy as you can be, and then your fetus, future baby, can be healthy as well. Those are the kinds of things that we should be talking about, and those are the kinds of resources that we should be putting money into. But you're going to be pretty hard pressed to find a clinic that is working in reasonable ways with women who have substance use disorder and who are pregnant. People don't want to do that work for a whole host of different reasons, including this idea of, again, being pregnant is the most wonderful thing that you can do as a woman. And so when you get pregnant, you should automatically be able to say, everything that I'm doing that potentially creates risks to this pregnancy, I'm just going to stop, right? Well, amazingly enough, sometimes being pregnant is not sufficient to get you to no longer have a drug addiction. And so we really have to think about these things, again, in ways that are not just about you should be a better person, but how do we put supports in place so that you can become the person that you want to be. I don't think that most people who are pregnant are thinking to themselves, what I want for the rest of my life is to be somebody with substance use disorder. Maybe some people are thinking that. I don't think that's where most people are. And yet, rather than figuring out how do we provide enough treatment beds, rather than figuring out how do we create enough clinics so people can get medication and be managed during their pregnancies, we would rather say, your lack of self-control, right? Because that's the assumption that folks are making. Your lack of self-control is creating risk to this fetus. And so what we're going to do is we're going to figure out how to make your life worse because you're not a good person, right? These like fundamental judgments about people's worth.
Yeah. Before medical school, I worked for a couple of years as a case manager at a substance abuse rehab for pregnant patients, and it was an inpatient facility. I mean, it was like kind of this unicorn place. Like they had six beds, and you could stay for a whole year.
Yeah.
And I think what I learned from that experience is that, you know, people end up leaning on substances for a variety of reasons. And I think for many of the people that we tried to help, like they had tremendous trauma in their lives. They had no mechanism for therapy or, you know, any type of like psychiatric support. And so substances were a way to escape or a way to self-manage their own, you know, whatever was going on in their lives. Yeah. And it's, you know, if we go back even a couple more steps, like how do we support people before, you know, they go down that path? I mean, those supports aren't there. I mean, getting psychiatric support or mental health support for anyone who is like, doesn't have like the, you know, the platinum insurance in this country is like impossible. Yeah. But we won't talk about that. We'll just talk about criminalizing more patients. And so that's how the system ends up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the sort of underlying ethos of our country is people, you know, picking themselves up by their bootstraps, that, you know, what it really means to be an American is to be somebody who is radically independent, who doesn't rely on the government for anything, unless it's a huge amount of, you know, corporate welfare. That's apparently okay, but not other kinds. And somebody who is fully autonomous, that they kind of live in this, you know, deeply individualized space, as opposed to being a country that says we are this deep network of interconnected people. If I am living my life and there are people who are suffering, that is a detriment to me, even if I'm going home to a nice house, right? And imagine sort of what our country would look like if, instead of feeling like, ooh, I hate seeing homeless people, they're the worst, if the response was, wow, how deeply sad am I that there are people who don't have homes? And what can I do? And what should we be doing? And how can I vote so that we become a place where that's not the case for so many people? I've been thinking about this a lot because of Mamdani in New York. And the number of people who are like, oh, I can't wait to see him fail. Why? You don't want people to have medical care? You don't want people to have child care? You don't want people to have homes? Why would you want to see him fail? Right? Like, what does it say about you as a person that you're like, I want more people to suffer, right? That's not a good thing. That doesn't say good things about you, you know? So we live in a very, very strange place. And, you know, I hope that somebody like Mamdani winning in New York is reflective of what we could be moving forward, that people are not just living this kind of ruggedly individual life, but we're really sort of thinking about ourselves as this connected world. And when people are hurting, that hurt is shared, right? As opposed to simply thinking, thank God it's not me. All of these things, I think, are changeable. And the reason why I think that they're changeable is because I have watched myself change over time, right? I mean, doing the work that I did at the HIV Law Project, where I was working with women who had such different life experiences than my own. When I was in law school, I also did a clinic where I worked with incarcerated women and sort of talking to them about how is it that you have ended up in this space, right? What is it that life didn't do for you and didn't give to you? You know, those experiences fundamentally changed the way I thought about so many things in the world. So I know that it's possible. I know that it's possible for people to look at the world differently. I know that it's possible for people to grow and mature. I know that it's possible for people to learn from life experiences. And sometimes that means being willing to be exposed to some of those things in order to help you understand the world a little bit better. But I feel like I am a much better person for having had those experiences and being humbled in that way, right? I often sort of think to myself, I live this life that I'm very proud of, and I'm very happy of, the career that I have and the kids that I have and the community that I have around me. But I was also born into a middle-class family with two parents who deeply loved each other. We're married for 50 years, would have been married longer if my mom hadn't passed away. I had enormous stability. I had access to terrific education. Imagine if instead of being born and raised in Silver Spring, Maryland, that I had been born and then raised somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a poor community where I had access to crappy public schools, and I had parents who were working really hard but were not able to be as present as my parents were for me. I don't think that I would be where I am today just because I was born special, right? I was born into a set of circumstances that allowed me to become the person who I am today. And everybody doesn't have that, right? That's a gift when you have that. And so if we sort of think about how lucky we are to have had certain opportunities and certain people in our lives and all those good things, that is not a reflection of your worth as a person. It's a reflection of the way that you got to come into the world. It's that old, that sort of, George Bush the second, right? Not the first, born on third base and thought he hit a triple, right? Like that's just not the way that the world works, right? Some of us get a leg up and some of us don't even have legs. So we really need to think about not just where we are, but how we got there and all the reasons why somebody else's journey is so different from our own, and how do we help shape their journey so that they can get some of the opportunities that we've got.
Have there been any students that have kept in touch with you? Any things that they've done that have been particularly inspiring to you?
Oh, wow. I have such great students. I have students who, graduate from law school and immediately open their own law practices, which is one of the boldest things I can imagine somebody doing. And one of them in particular, she's had her own law firm for years now. She was a little older when she came to us, but she has had her own law firm for years now. She had 2 kids when she came to law school, and she has a firm where she works with a lot of low-income people, where she works with people who are trying to make their way through our immigration system, which right now is particularly crucial work. And she is not only somebody who is doing all of this great work on a daily basis, but she's somebody who's doing pro bono work. And she's such a part of her community. I love talking to her, and I love seeing the great things that she's doing. And then I have students who are doing criminal justice work. And I'm so proud of them, right? Like I feel like I played even a small role in who they are. But I think the thing that always makes me happy is when a student or an alum reaches out to me and says something like, being in your class made me think about the world differently. I mean, that's pretty much the best thing you could ever have a student say to you. And I get those emails on a decent basis. And I'm always really happy to get those, because I feel like that's sort of the challenge of the classroom, that you invite people to see the world through a different lens, and not only see the world through a different lens in terms of how we got to where we are, but see the world in a different lens in terms of how do we make this place a different place, and how do we make this place a place where it's much more about empathy as opposed to judgment.
It's really awesome.
I love my job.
This podcast is executive produced by us, Dr. Bev Gray, Dr. Jonas Swartz, and Jane Marie. Production by Little Everywhere. Thanks to Nick Thorburn, Patrick Ford, and Maker for our score, and extra special thanks to everyone who lent their knowledge and voices to the show, especially Kim Mutcherson.
Do you have an idea for what we should talk about next, or just want to tell us? outlawedpodcast@gmail.com. Send us an email.